Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us all for our Asian Voices in Middle Grade. I'm so happy. This is like also the perfect way to end May as well. I didn't even realize it when we were talking about dates, but then when I was like thinking about it last week, I was thinking that this is going to be like the highlight of my month, basically. So just a little bit about me. I'm Lily, and I'm the moderator for this panel. I'm kind of a book reviewer and book kind of person, I guess, all over the internet on various social media platforms. And I obviously love books. That's why this is here. I wanted to talk quickly about our harassment policy. So here, obviously, we don't tolerate any harassment. And because it's our goal for a safe space to chat about my favorite things, which are books and bubble tea. So know that if we find any harassment of any kind or hate speech, you will be removed and or blocked from the chat. Actually, probably both. You'll probably be both removed and blocked from the chat. So now that's out of the way, I'm going to let these authors introduce themselves, and then we're going to chat because I have a lot of questions all about these fantastic middle grade worlds that have been created, and I can't wait. So anyway, on to the intros. Sylvia, do you want to start with the intro?
Sure. Hi, I'm Sylvia Liu. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. I write both picture books and middle grade, and I have a middle grade book out called Manatee's Best Friend. But my latest book is Hannah Shue in the Ghost Crab Nation. It's a middle grade sci-fi that's coming out in 3 weeks. So it's the story set in a world where teens get their brains connected to the multi-web when they turn 13, and the main character Hannah Shue finds out a conspiracy against her class of kids who are about to get their brains connected.
That sounds awesome. My name is Gracie Kim. I'm also so delighted to be here. I am the author of The Last Fallen Star, which is a Korean mythology inspired middle grade fantasy adventure about Korean witches. And I have my second book, The Last Fallen Moon, which is coming out in 2 weeks' time now. Yeah, due to supply chain issues, it has been moved, but I believe the date is now the 14th of June, and I'm very excited to share the second book.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me, Lily. So I'm Sangu. I'm the author of Kiki Kalira Conquers a Curse, which is actually the second book. The first book is Kiki Kalira Breaks a Kingdom, which came out last year, and this came out about a week ago. So it is very, very new. So this is a fantasy adventure inspired by South Indian mythology, the folklore I grew up with as a child, and it's about an anxious protagonist who's really struggling with undiagnosed OCD and how she uses art and creativity to cope with it. And then her magical sketchbook kingdom is brought to life, and she has to save the world.
Before I introduce myself, I just want to say I love that all of our books are like coming out around the same time. Which like I know my book just came out a month ago. I know my publisher did it for like API month. I feel like that was probably like everyone's like publisher's ideas. Anyway, I'm Katie Zhao, and I write mostly middle grade, young adult, fantasy, and some contemporary. This is my latest book, Winnie Zhang, Alicia's a Legend, which, as I said, came out 1 month ago. And Winnie Zhang Unleashes a Legend follows a 12-year-old girl named Winnie who is just starting middle school, and all she wants to do is like get by, like any kid her age does. And then one day she discovers her deceased grandmother's old cookbook, and she decides to make mooncakes from a recipe in the book. And in the process, she accidentally unleashes her grandmother's spirit and an evil spirit, as well as like discovers her own like dormant shaman powers. So instead of like just being able to like skate by in school, she now has to save the world on top of that.
I have read all of them and I love them so much. They are like definitely one of my favorite. Like these group of books are definitely one of my favorites that I've read this year, like period. I talked a little bit already about how much I love the world building, but I want to dive into that because the world building in these books and like in general, world building is probably my favorite thing anyway. But the world building in these books, I think, are truly like very detailed and unique. So I wanted to chat about how does one do this? How did the world sort of begin in your mind, and sort of is your world building process like? And maybe it's not the same for every book, so that would be super interesting to kind of figure out how it sort of comes alive, I guess. Gracie, do you want to start?
Absolutely. First of all, I'll take a step back because I totally forgot to actually talk about what my book is about. So the first book, The Last Fallen Star, is about a 12-year-old girl called Riley O, and all she wants ever is to become a healing witch, just like her sister and like her parents and like everyone in her community. Except she was adopted, which means the magical blood is not in her naturally, and so her sister Hattie finds out about the spell in which she can share half of her magic. They do it. All things go terribly wrong, as is wont to do in any good book. And then Riley has to go on the search for the last fallen star, whatever or wherever it may be, or risk losing her only sister forever. So for me, world building wise, I love world building. I just think it's the funnest thing because that's the part where you can truly get lost in your mind and create a world and then share that world with other people. So you can basically, I see it as creating a sandbox for everyone to play in. When I started world building this world, I really went back to it's about diaspora Koreans and specifically Korean Americans in LA because that's where the largest community of diaspora Koreans live outside of Korea. And I kept thinking back to what is real because I wanted it to be believable. And I think to do that, you base it, the foundations on what is real. So I thought of things like our Korean supermarket, like H Mart is probably the biggest, most well-known chain. I thought about Saturday school. I thought about Korean churches because that's such a huge part of the Korean community abroad. I even thought about things like bubble tea. So I rooted a lot of the world building in what was real. And I think that to me helps create a world that is exciting and believable, but also relatable.
Yeah, I'll echo what Gracie said, which is my story set 30 years in the future, but I really try to start with settings that, like are relatable to people. So a lot of my book takes place in a school. So I kept the school similar to what most, kids might think of, but then it was fun to add, VR pods and, screen walls, things that were a little bit more futuristic. And so a lot of times when I start world building, I start with the story, the character, and then how they interact with whatever setting they're in. And then once that setting comes to life, I try to add in the futuristic details. But one really fun setting that I did was I had them set in a historic mall that replicated the 90s. And so it was really fun to just remember, the books, the stores like Walden Books and, Ben and Jerry's and things like that. So, in that sense, I was able to have sort of what, was once contemporary for me, put into a historic setting.
Yeah, I'm just stuck on the fact that the 90s are historical, like to us. No. I think the first time someone said that the 90s are now historical fiction, I was just like, God, please just save me from old age. Yeah, so world building. I mean, typically I tend to try and include the magic, the fantasy, space, as in my last books, but also have an internal logic and include things that readers can relate to. But with Kiki, I actually had the most fun because the world in the books is Kiki's world. Like literally, it is out, it comes out of her imagination. So the whole thing is her sketchbook kingdom. So it can be as weird, it doesn't have to make sense, and it can just include so many different things that I think a young child, an 11-year-old, would organically come up with, the kind of thing I would have come up with at that age, that doesn't necessarily make any sense to anybody except her. And I think a running joke in the series is that people keep asking her why. Why is this like this? And she's kind of like, oh, well, I didn't know it was going to be real. But I did also want to include touchstones to the real world, and the fact that Kiki is British Indian. And so even though the world and the mythology is inspired by Indian folklore, she is also British, and that is a huge part of her identity. And so it is impossible to separate the two. So it was sort of both fun and I think rewarding for me to be able to include both things. Because I think often as authors of color in publishing, we are encouraged to sort of pick one or the other and not combine all the different parts of our identities. But it was really nice to do that here.
For me, my world building process is sort of like chaotic in the sense that it definitely changes from book to book, depending on how contemporary and like how much fantasy I wanted to add into the book. So, for example, for my debut middle grade contemporary fantasy, The Dragon Warrior, that book had more fantasy elements than Winnie Zhang, but it did also start with like the contemporary world. I thought about places that are like very rich and important to Chinese American history, so like Chinatowns, Chinese supermarkets, just thinking about like the kinds of experiences that I had as a kid that I thought like were kind of magical, and building upon that. For Winnie Zhang, the book was a little bit more contemporary, a little closer to home. So it felt more like I was writing from a place of experience, but just like adding like little bits and dashes of magic here and there. Winnie, like, she really is just like an average kid. She goes to school. She also like goes to Chinese school. Some like magical, chaotic things happen at Chinese school, which was really fun to write. But for the most part, it is like very much a grounded process. And so for Winnie Zhang, the world building there, I kind of wanted just to build a world around the characters and just like the contemporary world, and then like add bits of magic going from there. But yeah, I definitely do feel like when I'm trying to write fantasy books that have more fantasy elements, I sort of have to like I have to like discover the world as I write. So that's why I say like the process is chaotic, because like I'll be just like writing, and then I'll think like, oh, it'd be really cool if I added like dragons or like talking animals or something. But then of course you can't just do that halfway through. You have to like go back and revise and everything. So really like I'm all over the place, but I do my best to make it work.
Yeah, I love the inventiveness and also the ability to be flexible and to kind of pull things that you want, and not have to have everything set, I guess, before you start. I wanted to know, in honor of May, I suppose, how did you approach interweaving Asian culture, traditions, or stories into the book? And was this kind of an easy or difficult process? How was that to incorporate into your writing? Sylvia, do you wanna start us off?
Sure. Yeah. So my story is set in the United States, 30 years from the future, but in my future world, it's a very Chinese influence culture, because the corporations dominate, and one of the biggest corporations is a Chinese corporation. So it was kind of easy for me to just bring in a lot of my own, sort of background. I have a lot of food scenes that have Chinese food in it. I added Chinese slang, little tiny things, that are like common in like she comes home running from a chase scene and she still has time to just put her shoes, take them off, and at the door, before she goes in. So things like that, they were pretty, fun to do. So, but I don't think I overdid it. So, I think most of the story is really just a fun adventure thriller.
I think in my book, I didn't really think too hard about like what kind of like Asian American or Chinese American influences I could bring into the story. I think I just wanted to tell a story like from my heart, from my childhood, and like because it was just authentically me, like it just comes out that way. I didn't necessarily think like of how important food was to like Asian or Chinese culture, but I did end up revolving the book around food naturally because I just like really liked food as a kid. I will say though that I did consider how like food is sort of like an experience, like a bonding experience for families. And I think that's more true of like Asian culture than like Western culture. Like we really, really love our food and we have like so many holidays around it. And like, Winnie shares special moments with her family because of food. Like they're able to come to understandings because of food. And like just like these little like tidbits of just like growing up Asian American, they're all in the book. I didn't necessarily think about how can I make this more Chinese or how Asian. I just thought like how can I write a book that really just reflects like the way I grew up and who I was, and like because of that, like I just wrote like the most authentic story. It just came out that way.
It's interesting. I think for me, previous books that I had written were white centric because I learned very late that I could write my authentic story in my own culture and be inspired by my own stories and folk tales or whatever, and for that to be celebrated. I learned that so late that for me actually the process of writing this book was really interesting. It wasn't so much that I had to add in elements like Katie mentioned. It's almost like I had to stop censoring myself, because I would write something and then I would think, oh wait, would a non-Korean person or a non-Asian person understand what I'm saying? Do I need to explain this? I don't want to say dumb down, but do I need to basically whiteify this part of the story or this part of a character or a culture to make it more understandable and relatable? So for me, it was more a process of turning those kind of lights off and just saying, just write it as you would in the head of Riley O, who was growing up in this Korean American family, and then everything else can come later, but that was actually a lot harder than I thought it would be, because I was so conditioned into writing for the white gaze. And I think that was such an interesting experience to know that it's just programming and you have to actively learn to write otherwise. And the more you do it, the more easier and natural it becomes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, everything Gracie just said about having to not censor yourself, like that's a really good way of putting it, because it isn't so much about, at least for me, about adding things in, but about not stopping myself and not questioning myself. Every time I think, well, a British person, an American person, someone in the West is not going to understand this. And just doing it, just writing it. And the other thing that I wanted to keep in mind the whole time was that I grew up with food and stories. Like that was pretty much what, I mean, obviously I cannot speak for all Indians, but in my family growing up in India, it felt like we were just immersed all the time in food, a lot of which, all the food often had like a mythological or folkloric connection in some way, or the stories themselves. I mean, you couldn't walk 5 steps down the street without coming across a temple or a statue that had this amazing myth attached to it, because these stories were such an ancient, deeply immersed part of the culture. And I feel like for a long time after I moved here to the UK and started writing professionally, I lost a lot of that connection. I started to question whether I could or should write those stories, not just because I was now living here, but also because would anyone want to read them who wasn't actually, from the same place? And I think breaking that thought process was was hard but very rewarding. And I was lucky, I think, because Kiki came on the heels of my previous trilogy, which was a space opera inspired by Indian mythology. So I had started to break the thought process already, which helped, I think, a lot.
Yeah, that is such a good trilogy. I was so I loved it so much. And I wanted to come to sort of talk about use what you said as kind of like a segue because I wanted to talk about, growing up. I kind of talked a little bit about this. I mean, I've talked about this on the internet quite a lot, but like not having the variety and wealth and access to the kinds of stories that I'm like reading now, and obviously the stories that are in this panel, for example, and how affirming it is to see that and kind of, I guess, living vicariously now for like very young me. So I wanted to know kind of what were some influential stories for you growing up, and how that process has been for you. Katie, do you want to do you want to start us off?
I would love to. So I think there were different books that influenced me in different ways. So the book I would say that cultivated my love of middle grade contemporary fantasy the most was Percy Jackson, which is very basic, but here we are. That series is like so special to me because I basically grew up with Percy. Like book one came out when I was Percy's age, and then like Rick is like a machine. So every year there's like another book, and every year like I would get 1 year older. And it was like back then, like everyone in my class would be like reading these books, and like it was just like a way for us all to just like bond and just like I don't know, it's like a great way to bring the class together. And I just like I love the humor of Percy Jackson. I love like the world building, the mythology, and it's like been a huge influence on my own like mythology based middle grade. Um, and then I still have like very sharp memories of like picking up Lisa Yee's books when I was like very young, like maybe 11, 12. And I remember like picking up those books because they had Asian faces on the cover. And I was just so like blown away. I was like, I didn't know that was allowed. Like I didn't know publishers would let you do that. And like reading those books, I think she wrote like Millicent Min, Girl Genius, and there was like a book before that. I forget the title now. Stanley somebody. Stanford Wong flunks big time. And I just love those books because they just felt like so authentically Asian American, and I had never had that rep before. And I think outside of that, there was Grace Lynn's books, but I didn't discover those until I was a little bit older, maybe like older teenager, even early college years. But those were like some like Chinese legend inspired stories that really influenced my writing. Yeah, I think like I was like very much mostly inspired by middle grade titles. Those are still like the most like when I think of the most formative books that have like influenced me as an author, I would still point to middle grade, and I would point to those most like formative years where I was already noticing that I wasn't seeing people who looked like me. And I think that's something that really like drove me to want to be somebody who could write stories like that.
I'll go next. For me, it was actually more than stories, like more than existing books. It was the stories that I heard at home. So my parents were always working, very typical immigrant family story. My parents were working 3 part-time jobs just to put food on the table, 2 younger sisters. So there were 3 of us. And my Harimoni, our grandmother, she basically raised us at home. And I mean, she was already quite elderly, and 3 rambunctious, loud young girls. That must have been pretty tough. And so she used to tell us all these stories of ghosts and scary tokebi goblins and all these scary creatures that would basically come and kidnap us away if we didn't behave. So we would all, and at the time we were all, we didn't have separate rooms, let alone separate beds. Nana and the 3 of us all shared one bed together. And she would, just to get us to go to sleep, tell us these stories, And I remember at the time thinking that my Haimoni had just made these stories up just on the fly. Like, I didn't realize they were rooted in our culture and our history and our stories. I just thought they were her stories. And I remember this moment where a Korean kid ended up coming to our school, and she mentioned like dokebi, which is a type of goblin, and I was like, "What? How do you know this story?" And just being so amazed by that. And so for me, it wasn't actually so much books. I loved books, but because books weren't really something that I thought I could be a part of, like books were this safe place in this amazing different world that I could escape into, but it was so far removed from my world and my future and me. It was this other thing. And it was only much later in life, actually, Zoraida Cordova's book, Labyrinth Lost, about Latinx witches, and I've always loved anything to do with witches and the supernatural. That was probably, in terms of inspiration for me writing these types of books now, was me being like, whoa, okay, so we can write our own stories inspired by things that we loved in mainstream culture growing up and put our own spin on it. And for that to not only be okay, but for that to be celebrated, I remember like that breaking my mind. So for me, yes, books at a later date, but when I was younger, definitely more of the homegrown stories.
Yeah, I think uh, whenever people ask me about books that have influenced me or that I've read, I just forget every book I've ever read in my whole life. It's just all gone. But as a child growing up, the books that we had access to were limited, and this is like when I was growing up. I'm 34, so the 90s was sort of my formative reading age, reading chapter books and middle grade books. And in the 90s in India, I mean, I think in general in the world, the publishing landscape was a lot whiter. Books were a lot whiter. But in India, we got very limited numbers of books, and it tended to be the classics. Agatha Christie, Enid Blyton, lots of white British ladies who wrote books a long time ago. And the thing is, I do love them. There's a lot to love about those books, and I grew up with them. And they brought a lot of magic and mystery and fantasy. And I still love British folklore, in part because of Enid Blyton, because there is so much lore. Irish, Scottish, British, just the whole like island. But I didn't have anything that really reflected me. And so I remember that when I first started writing, it was all white characters all the time, always. And I'm talking like 11, 12, 13, 14. When I was writing like stories at these ages, it was just white people all the time, because I just didn't think that I could be a superhero, be a witch, be any of those things. And it was only later with books like Percy Jackson, and I think really a lot later, like teenage years, when I started seeing books that actually felt like they spoke to me. So yeah, for good or for not so good, my most influential books as a child were like the Enid Blytons and Agatha Christie's.
Yeah, I have a similar experience because I grew up in Caracas, Venezuela in the 80s, but the books that were available probably came more from like the 70s, And so I was definitely reading, or 60s or earlier. So I was reading, like, I love fantasy, but they were like Lloyd Alexander, J.R.R. Tolkien, and I read Enid Blyton and Agatha Christie. And so, yeah, the whole genre was very white. But I do remember back then, when I was a teen, reading the Joy Luck Club. So it was an adult book, but that was one of the first ones where I saw like my family's like, oh, mahjong and, like all these intergenerational issues. And so that kind of thing. But at that point, like, Sangu and Gracie, I never really thought like I would be an author. And I actually did not become an author till much later in life. I went on to law school and did that for a decade. And so I really came to children's writing when my kids were young. And that was already like, we were much, we're coming to the current era where, there's so much. And then when I started writing middle grade, which is just in the last like 7 or 8 years, there's just so much. And so, all of the Rick Riordan Presents books, for example, really inspire me, like Katie Zhao's books, etc. So so it's great to like now all my peers are who, influence me, I think.
Yeah, I've never read Percy Jackson, so I feel like I almost don't like to say that. I think that it kind of like makes me quite quite embarrassed at this point now. But yeah, I also don't think I had read I'm just trying to remember for me as well, if I had to answer the question too. I don't think I remember reading like a book. I mean, besides maybe a picture book, but like a book with a middle grade Asian person, like uh until I don't know, maybe like 10, I mean, like relatively recently. I mean, past I was that target age group, definitely, for those books. Um, I want to chat about some individual aspects of the books that I really love. So let's start with, okay, so both Kiki and Hana deal with difficult topics such as mental health, and also my favorite sci-fi topic of sort of disinformation and manipulation. Um, and so I wanted to talk about how you balance these kinds of conflicts with your stories, and sort of what was the inspiration behind these elements, and also if there was any pushback, because I think that some of the conversations, at least I've been seeing online, have been kind of pushing sort of categorizing issues as kind of like difficult or too complex for middle grade readers. And so that's what I mean if there was any pushback, because I feel like that's conversation that I've sort of recently been kind of witnessing.
Well, I guess I'll start for my book, which has a lot to do with technological information, disinformation. I actually wrote it sort of, it was the year like following the 2016 election, and when all the news about like how Cambridge Analytica was using people's data to influence, not just your shopping habits, but really like politics and, a lot of fundamental aspects of our society. And so that was a lot of the basic like motivation for me to write this book. And so I ended up putting, weaving those themes in, even though the surface plot is really not really about that. But I guess since my book hasn't come out yet, I haven't gotten any pushback so far. So far, my early readers have been very kind. So we'll see.
Yeah. So a lot of Kiki's whole story begins with her mental illness, because although it's not by any means all of her, it is a big part of her, just like it's a big part of me. And I wanted to make sure I included that as authentically as I could on the page, because I mean, especially given the last couple of years, it is a rare child who is not struggling with some kind of anxiety right now. And I know that growing up as I did, in spite of having a very loving, supportive family, mental health was just one of those blank spots. I don't know if it's, I mean, I do feel like it is quite an Asian thing that you sort of, you get on with it. Mental illness is something to be sort of pushed aside. You just get over it. Just get up and go. Just do it. And I grew up with this idea that because I couldn't, there must be something wrong with me. And so it was hugely important to me to put like right there on the page that there is absolutely nothing wrong with Kiki, nothing wrong with the way she feels. It is an illness. That's it. And it is a big topic. It is a difficult one. And I think I was quite lucky in that I did not at any point get any pushback from people saying it was too difficult. I think most people have found that that aspect of the book really resonates with them and with their children, because I think of the last couple of years in particular. But I think that for the most part, the most pushback I got was from myself, because it is a very personal thing to dig into. And I kept having to, much like with cultural and Asian and Indian aspects of the book, I did have to keep reminding myself that I didn't need to censor myself, that it was okay to kind of put these things on the page. So yeah, pushback was me, really.
And I also loved Kiki's relationship with her mom. I thought that it was specifically because it is related to the mental illness like conversation as well. I thought that relationship, it made me very emotional, but I thought that relationship was just so beautiful.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to say that because I thought that was a really like important and very moving like part of Kiki and like part of, I guess, the foundational Kiki character. So talking as well about, I mean, on the topic of family, which is something I always like to chat about, but sibling relationships specifically interest me, being that I have a sibling. So I wanted to talk about Winnie and The Last Fallen Star because both of them feature kind of complex, I don't really know how to describe it, like complex family slash sibling stuff. And so I wanted to know how you can balance like these family kind of drama, family conflict, while also maintaining a sense of pacing for, you know, the action or the fantasy elements of the story. And also, I wanted to know a little fun facts if you had any interactions like between the family or between siblings that you had to cut out of the story and what those were.
So I think family dynamics are always complicated, like no matter which family. Like you can have a great relationship with your family members, but you're still gonna like have fights from time to time. You're gonna like disagree on this and that. Um, and I just feel like middle grade is the space to like really bring out family dynamics because at least for me growing up, like I was like pretty close to my family. So I have siblings as well. I'm the eldest and I have two younger sisters. So they like drove me wild when I was younger. Um, but it's just like something that like when I think of middle grade, like it's just something that comes naturally to me because I spent so much time in my formative years, just like with my family, like cultivating these relationships. And you know, specifically in Winnie Zhang, I wanted to write a sister dynamic where the sisters have gone off into like different stages of life. So Winnie is the youngest, and her older sister Lisa is in high school. Winnie has just started middle school, and so at the beginning of the book, Winnie is just sort of like reminiscing on how close they used to be, and now suddenly like Lisa's wearing like blue eyeshadow and she's like too cool for Winnie, which I think is something that I did to my sisters. So this is like a belated apology, I guess. And I wanted to explore that dynamic because I don't know if I've seen it explored that much in middle grade. And it just like rang so true and authentic to my childhood that I felt like it has to be true for other readers who also have siblings who might be going through the same thing. And I think like being able to write these experiences helps just to show kids like you're not alone going through this. It's just this is something that might naturally happen. And throughout the book, I wanted to show that yes, Winnie and Lisa do have like a sort of a complicated dynamic. They're not as close as they used to be, but I did show moments where they sort of like reconcile, you know, have those like sweet sister moments because I did have a lot of those when I was younger. As for scenes that I cut out, I actually don't think I cut out any. Probably there was like some like silly extra like banter that my editor made me cut out because I always do that. Like I always have way too much dialogue in the story, and my editor is like, "All right, we gotta keep it moving." But I think like the heart of their sister dynamic was like preserved throughout the book, and I actually think my editor pushed me to like add a little bit more of it just because of how much the action and like the actual plot of the story ended up being intertwined with the sister dynamic. That was another like thing that I wanted to do with this book was to make family not just like in the background, like just sort of like, you know, Winnie has a family, but they're not really involved in the magic. It's like, no, Winnie has a family. And even though like she's like the only active shaman, her family ends up being involved in the magic too in certain ways. And it, you know, I don't want to go into spoiler territory, but like the complicated family dynamic definitely plays into how the plot moves forward. So that was something that I wanted to do with this book.
Like Katie, I mentioned before, I'm also the eldest of three girls, and they are my best friends. I love them more than anything. And I knew going into this book that I wanted to write a sister story. And in fact, I can't avoid it. I'm writing a new series right now, and it's like another sister story. I tried not to make it a sister story, but it's a sister story. And so they kind of infiltrated everything in Riley's relationship with her sister, and it's weird because it just happens. It's kind of like food, you know, infiltrating so many of our stories naturally. It kind of naturally permeated into my books too. And it was a specific thing about family that I really wanted to mention, not just the sister relationship, but in so many middle grade stories I remember reading growing up, the main character was always from, not always, but often from either a broken family or a family that's forgotten about them, or they're alone, or, you know, and often it's a tactic because, you know, we want these really young characters to have these huge life-changing adventures, and if their parents always getting in the way, there's always, you know, a bit of an issue of how to get rid of the parents. So I get that, but I kind of wanted to describe this world in which you can have two parents. So the main character is adopted, but she comes from this loving family. Her she doesn't know her bio family, but her found family loves her more than anything, and she loves her more than anything. And yet she still sometimes feels like an outsider. And I wanted to make that a thing too, that you don't have to be abandoned or left behind to still be grappling with that feeling of belonging and wanting to know your place in your family, your friendships, and the world. So that was kind of a huge part of it for me too. And in terms of scenes that were cut, there were so many scenes that were cut between her and her sister. Just random scenes of her doing, I don't know, just going on a bus. Like there were just scenes of them just going on a bus ride, going to the Korean supermarket and getting banana milks, and like, you know, banana milks splaying in the bus, and just talking to people on the bus, like completely unrelated scenes that had nothing to do with anything, but they were just hanging out with each other. And I loved them, but I remember my agent and editors at the time were like, this serves absolutely no purpose. Like absolutely nothing. And my argument was always that in a lot of K-dramas, for example, you just see a lot of these characters just being with each other, and you just get to know them and their interactions, and it's that time that you spend with them that makes you have affection towards them. We even have a word in Korean, tong, for it. It's this affection and fondness you feel for someone. Even it can be an enemy, it doesn't actually have to be a friend, but by virtue of the time that you spend with them. And so that was my argument. I was like, we need to see them on the page, but the reverse is also true, that especially in middle grade, we want to get straight into the action, right? There's a little less leeway at the beginning of middle grade books to do that scene setting. I think it can come naturally later, but in middle grade, we want to really grab our readers' attention from the get-go. And so the inciting incident and the call to adventure happens pretty fast. So it is what it is, but later on, perhaps I can include a lot more just sister banter.
I think we're going to switch to audience questions because there are a few that look really good. Also, I wanted to remind everyone that if you have audience questions, you should put them in the chat, and hopefully we will get to them. The first one that I saw was for books with mythology, how did you research the mythology aspect specifically? So I'm not actually sure who should start with this one.
I'll go. It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, so the stories that Kiki is inspired by are the stories I grew up with, and they are very specific to the part of India where I grew up. So if you kind of imagine that, you know, India is like a big triangle, like way down there, and in the south. And it was, for a very long time, there was the Kingdom of Mysore, which covered quite a lot of the south of India. And there is like a wealth of folklore. And now Mysore is a single city. And I didn't grow up there, but I grew up quite close in a different city. But we went there quite a lot. And the legend and the myth that sort of kicks off Kiki's story is about a demon king who took over this kingdom, and a warrior goddess who rode in on the back of a lion and battled him and won and saved the day and saved the kingdom. And because it's sort of, like I said, you can't really go far without a temple or a statue or something that reminds you of these stories. They were such a part of me growing up that the research I did when I started writing these books was part refreshing my memory, part sort of FaceTiming my parents and being like, so these bits of the story, am I remembering them right? Or did I just change them in my head? And partly just kind of looking at different sources, both online and in books, just to get different angles, because you never get the same story. The thing about folklore is that everyone has a different version. In fact, the warrior goddess has about 5 different names, depending on which part of India you're hearing about the story. So yeah, it was just a combination of those 3 things: a bit of actual research and a bit of pestering my family and a bit of delving deep into my mind.
I'd like to add to that. I have a very similar experience. They were really inspired, like I mentioned before, from the stories I grew up with. But I wanted to make sure that I was doing them justice, to reflecting them right. So I tried to do a lot of research, and I banged on the doors of my parents too. And they were helpful and they weren't helpful, because they were like, well, what do you want to know that stuff for? This is just this thing that happened, it's not real. And I was like, yeah, but I want to know the real story. They're like, there is no real story. It's just, there are all stories, and every different region of Korea will tell you a different version of it. And I tried to do my own research online and through books. And my Korean is fine, but I'm just not as proficient in reading thick books in Korean as I am in English. And so it was hard. Like, it was really hard to find information that I could really that resonated with me and that I could use. And even then I realized that they were different. Oral tradition stories from different parts were also different. And I really battled with this, because I wanted to make sure, especially as a diaspora person, to reflect these stories truthfully. And then someone told me that all our oral tradition stories change with the storyteller, that what we're doing is adding to the canon and adding to the times, and we add details from our current lives and cultures and environments, and that doesn't detract from the stories, it adds to them. They develop and change and grow. And that gave me the permission to just lean into my stories, because I was so worried that I wouldn't be representing them accurately. But I guess what I learned is that there is not really an accurate way. They are our stories, and by adding to them and sharing them and adding our own twist and canon on it, we are building them and making them stronger, and also allowing them to live on.
Okay.
I honestly don't
Oh,
know.
I was like,
I feel like I should say something, because I incorporated mythology in like my middle grade. But I don't know if I have that much more to add. I think, yeah, like similar to what Gracie and Tongu were saying, I pretty much like my research was like just like knowledge that I had from like going to Chinese school as a kid, hearing these stories from my parents. There was this Chinese story that was adapted into a cartoon called Journey to the West, which like that is like my basis for all Chinese mythology. And it's just like such a fun show that I watched as a kid, that like I just never really forgot like the basics. And outside of that, I actually like I also did want to like make sure I was like doing this right, depicting the mythology accurately. And so I did go online and just like try to like look for different versions of the story, and in doing so I realized there's no one version of the story. Like every single page or article I found had a different version, and I was like, well, at this point, I could just totally make something up, right? So I think it was a combination of all those things. And I think I did used to have this concern that, as someone who's Chinese American and was not born and raised in China, it like I had to be extra careful with like writing the mythology and all that. But after having like a few books under my belt, it sort of like hardened me and like thickened my skin. And I realized like readers are all going to have different interpretations of your books anyway, based on like their own experience. Like somebody could have read a totally different version of like one mythology story, and maybe they don't know there are different versions, and for that reason they might say, oh, this like interpretation is wrong, but they don't really have the full picture. So I just try not to like worry too much about it anymore, because like readers are going to have a million different opinions on your story, and all we can do is try to tell the stories that we want to tell to the best of our ability and make ourselves happy.
Okay. Another question that I thought was really interesting was, what was the biggest craft challenge you've ever faced so far in your journey as authors?
I guess I'll answer it. I feel like every time I start a novel, I'm starting from scratch and I don't know how to write. So just every project is different and has a different challenge. So I have a book. My work in progress is one where I'm doing two POVs for the first time, and so that's been a challenge, and it's been interesting. But the hard part is making both stories just as interesting and compelling, because like I hate it as a reader when I'm not as invested in one of the POVs, and then that POV comes up and I'm like, oh, okay, you're just slogging through it. And so that's been a challenge.
I I struggle with pacing in terms of craft, especially in middle grade, because, like I think Gracie was saying earlier, you don't really have a lot of room to set the scene. You've got to just kind of jump in, and I absolutely hate writing action scenes. Like I hate them so much. And but I write fantasy and adventure and I love them, but I hate the action scenes. I hate battles. I hate kind of it's not the actual battle. Like I love the emotional aspects. I love the drama, but it's like his foot went there and her leg did that, and I'm just like, no, I don't know, I don't care. Sometimes my characters end up with like 6 feet from where they go. So I do struggle with that. And so whenever there's an action scene, which of course happens a lot when you're writing a fantasy adventure middle grade, I I find that it happens a little too quickly. The editorial note I often get is, can we maybe milk this action scene a little more? Whereas on the flip side, I love conversation and dialogue and like character relationships. And I mean, you do need those in middle grade. You do absolutely need them. But I tend to do a lot of that. And I also get the occasional editorial note of, maybe we can trim this back a little bit, get to the action. So that has been my biggest challenge, I think, craft-wise.
Gosh, for me, I don't know if it's so much craft, but it's the persistence required in writing that I find really challenging, because I think the way I work naturally in all things in life, but especially in work, is to set a goal and then go hardcore running for the goal and then achieve it, take a break, and then do it all over again. I'm very goal focused. It's just the way my brain works. And this idea that, I mean, first of all, first drafting a book is the worst thing known to humankind. I just find it the most painful thing ever. And it never ends. You try to do a little bit every day, and every day it just feels like Groundhog Day. And you're like, well, why can't these characters just write themselves? Because it takes them so long to do anything on the page. And then you finally get to the end. I even have a sticker chart because that's how much I need the like external validation to keep going, where I give myself different, like I draw a little green shoot if I've made progress, but I get a special like cupcake sticker if I finish a chapter and stuff to keep myself going. And then you get to the end of a first draft and you're like, yes, I've done it. And then you send it off, and then you get like 19 pages of edits that you have to do, and then you have to do it all over again, and then again, and then again. And I think for me, it's just that mental load of knowing that it's never truly over because I want it to be nicely packaged away and done so I can move on, but I can never turn off until the book is, published and it's on the shelf. But that can take years, and the whole idea of juggling different projects at the same time, I find that extremely difficult, again, because my brain is so focused on one task at a time. So it's more that kind of thing. I mean, all craft is difficult, but for me, those little things I can work through and overcome. But the larger kind of, like I said, the mental load is probably the biggest challenge for me.
I think for me, I don't know if this is a challenge, but I think of it as like a flaw of mine. I'm like very much an underwriter. So I don't think I used to be this way, but like with having like juggling like multiple deadlines and always thinking ahead to my next books, like I feel like once I sit down to draft a book, I'm like already like trying to think ahead to the next one. So all I want to do is just like hit every like plot beat and then just like move on. So I've like turned in first drafts that were like not even 40K words, and like a novel is like 50K, right? And middle grade has to be at least like 50K. And I've gotten like notes from the editors now, like, hey, this is like a little bit short. Why don't we like flesh out some of these character arcs and like add more words and story? So that's like something that I've been struggling with. So rather than like having, I think what people typically have is like an overwriting issue. I like just don't write enough, and then that ends up being a struggle in revisions because then I'm like, well, now I have to add like 20,000 more words. I don't even know like where to begin to do that.
Okay, and the last question that we have, which I think is really fun, which is, what is your favorite thing to do when you're not writing a book?
Reading them. I feel like that's such a predictable and potentially boring answer because we're all writers and therefore all readers. But yeah, reading them. I could do that all the time. If I could just read books and not have to write them, if they just write themselves. It's very rude, really, that they don't. But yeah.
I'm kind of like a musical person outside of writing, so I really like to like sing like at karaoke or just like listen to music, go to concerts and all that. So because now I do like my writing professionally, like music is like my second creative love that is just like purely like hobby, would never try to like make money off of it. And it's just like a fun release for me. It's like my stress outlet that I use now because writing just stresses me out so much.
I love just being outdoors on the beach. So that's sort of my favorite place. And when I get a chance to travel, I love scuba diving.
I love to eat. I just love food. I love thinking about food. I love, most of the time I like making it. Most of the time I just like eating it, really. So yeah, all things food. I also love dancing, and in the past, before having a child, I used to do a lot of dancing out of my home. But these days, with a 2-year-old, we end up just turning music on the speaker in the lounge, and we just have crazy dance parties. The best dance parties ever. They're mostly to nursery rhymes, which is unfortunate, but you got to go through that phase to get to the other music. So yeah, we do a lot of dancing, and eating and dancing, and eating and dancing.
Yeah, I tried to start knitting as my like non-reading hobby, but then I thought, oh, wouldn't it be really cool if I listened to audiobooks while I knit? I'd be super productive. So it's been counterproductive actually, because I do think it's important to have like something you do that isn't like, or at least for me, that isn't tied to like looking at something as much, I guess, if that makes any sense, especially with the screens and whatnot. So that was my answer to the question. Thank you all so much for talking about these amazing books. The links to the bookshop.org, I think, is the domain. The links are in the description box below, so definitely make sure to pre-order/order the books. Also, I dropped the giveaway link in the chat a few times, but I think I just dropped it now. And also thank you everyone to ask questions. I know we didn't get to all the questions. There are a bunch of questions that I might like save for future panels because I really did like them, but we are bound by time. And yeah, thank you all for joining, and I hope everyone had a really great time. And remember to find these books for you and for your shelves and for your hearts, because I love them all so much. All right, I hope. Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much.
I hope everyone has a really great reading day, week, month, year, and everyone has a really great just day after this. Anyway, all right. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks for organizing
Bye.
this.
Thank you.